And these are two different things. And so I begin talking about the next 30 years by asking you to, believe me or not, accept that the foundation of the next 30 years will remain American power. Because it takes a long time for that kind of power to disappear. Economic growth is incremental, percentage points here and there. What changes the world is wars. The Great Depression didn't occur because this one or that one made a mistake. It occurred because of the First World War. And the fact that Germany, the most productive power of Europe, ceased to function, ceased to purchase products, and the entire international system collapsed. The American surge after World War II occurred because we were the only major power that wasn't bombed, that wasn't destroyed in the war, that made a profit. We emerged from the war in an enormously powerful position. War matters. As much as we would like to think that it's all about economics, the quantum shifts of the 21st century occurred because of conflict, or because of the lack of conflict, the lack of a nuclear war in the Cold War. When we think of this, we then have to address China, because we cannot think of the world without thinking of China, because China has obsessed the world. In the same way that Japan obsessed the world in the 1980s, and the conviction of everybody in the world was that Japan would shortly bypass the United States and everyone else, because it had mastered some unique method of management that would allow it to be more efficient, more profitable than anyone else. So now we have China, our obsession. And here again we have to be stupid and ask some basic questions about China. Talk about China. China is a country of 1.3 billion people. 600 million of them, according to the Chinese government, live in households earning less than $3 a day. That is, almost half of China lives in extraordinary poverty. Another 440 million Chinese, again, Chinese government statistics, earn $6 a day or less, $3 to $6 a day. That means over 1 billion people in China live in extraordinary poverty. The China that we see on television with the high skyscrapers and everything else, where people earn $20,000 a year or more, has 70 million people in it, 60 million actually. That's a lot of people. But it is less than 5% of China. This isn't China. This is the optical illusion of China. That is, it is one part of China, an important part of China, but it is not China altogether. And China cannot be understood unless this region is understood as an island in a much larger country. And this China cannot sell the products it makes to the other China. It is not a question of some stimulus. When you're making $3 a day, you can't buy an iPod. So those that manufacture iPods must export them. And China is hostage to the appetites of the United States and Europe, because its industrial plant is vastly superior to anything that China can consume. It must sell overseas. Can it sell? Well, this depends on whether or not the American financial markets invent another subprime crisis. And the great American export is truly unemployment. Because if we stop buying, what happens to the Chinese workers? And this is the nightmare of the Chinese. Unemployment, as it was to the Japanese before them. Because unemployment in China does not mean your pension plan is in trouble. Unemployment in China is an existential crisis. Therefore, China depends on its exports. And according to Chinese statistics, the profit margin on Chinese exports are 1.7% on average. Which means many of these exports are at or near zero profitability, much as Japanese exports in the 1990s were. How does the Chinese government handle this? with loans to marginal businesses and state-owned enterprises to keep them in business. And those loans create inflation. And that inflation raises the wage rate of China until China now is no longer competitive as a wage market with other countries. It is cheaper to invest and use Mexican labor than Chinese. Cheaper by far to use Indonesian labor. Cheaper to use Filipino labor, Pakistani labor, and so on. The period when China had an inherent advantage in low-priced products is disappearing. And the period in which China has promised to compete in the world in high-end technology has not yet emerged. China, therefore, has problems. This is not a condemnation of China. China has had an extraordinary 30-year history. It is a breathtaking event in the annals of Asia and in the annals of economics. But 30 years of growth does not mean 60 years of growth automatically. Because the business cycle exists, and in due course, things must correct themselves. And we are seeing China in the process of the correction. It's always interesting to me that Business Week in 1993 ran a cover about the Japanese economic miracle long after the Japanese financial system had melted down. It takes a long time for the media to catch up. This is not to say that China will collapse. It is not to say that China will cease to be important any more than Japan has ceased to be important. It simply means that at a certain point in your economic cycle, you change the way you behave. And as you change the way you behave, your role in the international system changes. And I think the Chinese are aware of the problem, are afraid of social instability, and are acting as they do with good reason. I don't think that China is going to disappear, nor will I think it'll be the dominant power of the next 30 years. The next 30 years will look different than that. Let's begin with the Europeans. The problem of the European Union is not some passing problem with the Greeks not paying their taxes. It is that the European Union created a free trade zone in which the world's second largest exporter, Germany, was able to sell goods to developing economies, thereby destroying their own economic development. Free trade is a wonderful idea, but Germany, if it had a free trade zone in 1955, would not have become the Germany it is today. Secondly, Germany and the EU created rules that made entrepreneurship in countries like Romania or Greece or Spain extremely difficult. I like to say that in Europe you don't hire a worker, you adopt him, which is very difficult for entrepreneurs to do. And therefore Europe is in a deep crisis, because the idea of the EU was based on the idea of perpetual prosperity. The European Union was perfectly built to handle prosperity. It could not handle economic crisis. And so now the Germans are reconsidering their position in the European Union, because truly they're going to have to subsidize it, while countries like Ireland and Greece and other countries are considering what exactly the benefit of the European Union is to them. And unlike a United States, where some people are willing to fight and have a battle over whether the Union would survive, there is no moral commitment to the Union itself in Europe. And now we see the Europeans reordering themselves and a very close relationship developing between Germany and a resurgent Russia. The Germans are dependent on Russian natural gas. The Russians want German technology. And the former Prime Minister, Gerhard Schroeder, sits on the board of Gazprom. This is an intimate relationship. It makes sense. It was also the foundation of three wars. The First World War, the Second World War, and the Third World War, and the one we didn't have, the Cold War, all turned around the relationship between Russia and Germany. Because from the point of view of Western Europe or the United States, the amalgamation of Germany and Russia, of Russian resources and German technology,